I'm referring in terms of the four implications, the implications with regard to the overall struggle against racism, the implications for the integrity of the United Nations, and here I want to join in my words with Dennis McShane, that if we did not have the UN, we would have to invent it. And so whenever I speak in critique of what is happening at the UN, I do so as a proponent of the UN that seeks its reform, not certainly its dismantling. The implications for the underrepresented voices, the voices of the victims that we do not hear enough or listen to enough, let alone act upon, that we will hear immediately following my remarks. And the implications, perhaps most importantly, for the need for moral leadership in our time. The need for moral leadership particularly by governments, by intergovernmental institutions, by NGOs, by those who purport to speak on behalf of victims of inhumanity and who are designated and delegated to speak on behalf of humanity. Let me turn now to those four manifestations. I'll speak briefly to each and bear in mind their larger implications for those four considerations that I mentioned. First, there is the state-sanctioned cultures of hate. I use expressly the word state-sanctioned because a culture of hate that is orchestrated by the state, that is planned by the state, that is sanctioned by the state, is much more pernicious and dangerous than hate that is carried out within a democracy by groups that can be held accountable and the like. I'm referring, though, as I said, to state-sanctioned cultures of hate, whose epicenter is Ahmadinejad's Iran. In a word, denying the Holocaust as it incites to a new one while engaged in the massive repression of the rights of its own citizens. That is why I always use the term Ahmadinejad's Iran, to distinguish it from the people and publics of Iran, who are otherwise themselves the targets of Ahmadinejad's domestic repression and who are the targets of that selective discrimination and targeting of those victims. But as Elie Wiesel would put it, what concerns him most is not the state-sanctioned cultures of hate or that represented by the epicenter of Ahmadinejad's Iran. What concerns him the most is the indifference and inaction by the international community, and as I said, those designated institutions designated to act on our behalf. Their silence, their indifference, their inaction. Let there be no mistake about it. Ahmadinejad's Iran has been repeatedly violating the prohibition in the Genocide Convention against the direct and public incitement to genocide. Simply put, it has already committed the crime of incitement to genocide. And state parties, be it my country or other state parties to the Genocide Convention, are obliged by law, this is not a question of a policy option, are obliged by law to prevent such incitement and to hold Iran accountable. Yet, as I meet and speak with you today, there is not one state party, I repeat, not one state party to the Genocide Convention that has taken the modest step in terms of holding Iran accountable, the modest step of simply referring this culture of hate to any agency of the United Nations to hold Iran to account. Notwithstanding the fact that, as I say, state parties are obliged under the Genocide Convention to do so. That is why, at the same time, I must say that I have been encouraged by two developments. One was the walkout that took place on the occasion of Ahmadinejad's once again dissemination of hate. But I want to remind you that this dissemination of hate that took place 2 days ago was mild in comparison to that which has been going on now for the last 4 years in particular, and even before. It was at the beginning of this century that the supreme Ayatollah leader Ali Khamenei said there's no solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict without the annihilation of the Jewish state. His words, not mine. And one can go on. And there have been the use of incendiary and inflammatory epidemiological metaphors which have referred to Israel and Jews in terms of bacteria, germs, stinking corpses, cattle, barbarians of humanity. You heard none of that in the United Nations when Ahmadinejad spoke 2 days ago. Yet, when he spoke with a much modest expression of hatred, the countries walked out. I want to say that if the state parties to the Genocide Convention, which included, I believe, all those who walked out, let alone all those who decided not to attend the conference, had been acting all these years to hold Ahmadinejad's Iran to account, we would not have had that spectacle at the United Nations. Because Ahmadinejad did not deserve to be an honored guest and have a podium at the United Nations. Ahmadinejad belongs not because I say so, but because international law so obliges. Ahmadinejad belongs in the docket of the accused, not at the podium of the United Nations. The second encouraging development is that a group of international legal scholars, genocide experts, survivors of the genocide, amongst them Esther Mujarraro, have come together and have endorsed a petition called the Responsibility to Prevent petition. This says precisely that state parties to the Genocide Convention have the responsibility under international law, and Louise Arbour, the former United Nations Commissioner of Human Rights, who's one of the signatories to this petition, has said that the responsibility to prevent this state-sanctioned incitement is of the highest legal order. It's an overriding legal obligation. And I trust people will associate themselves with this petition so that we hold Ahmadinejad's Iran to account by law, under international law, and there will be no more podiums at the United Nations for Ahmadinejad. This brings me to the second reason for Elie Wiesel's concern, I suspect, and anguish. And that is what he has otherwise called, and I'm perhaps paraphrasing by way of abbreviation, the laundering of anti-Semitism under the cover of the struggle against racism. This adds to bigotry the hypocrisy of masking a legitimate concern with anti-Semitism and racism by indicting Israel with the two twin evils of the 20th century, apartheid and Nazism, and saying that Israel embodies these two twin evils, and to do so as prologue and justification for the dismantling of the Jewish state.